Got it. Okay. So we tested this the other day, Steve. So
okay.
I think I was able to share properly.
Okay, great.
Once the option was available, I was able to share.
Cool.
Okay, so thank you so much everyone for joining. So this is the 15th edition of Annual Information Security Summit, DSCI and NASCOM hosting. So today is the first day of our Annual Information Security Summit, and we are hosting the workshop, industry workshop with association with the FireEye. The topic today we are having is assumption-based security to validation by the intelligence-based security. And I have eminent panelists with me. I have Steve Ledgian, who is the CTO attack for FireEye. I have Shashwat Hegde, who is a security research architect for FireEye. So welcome. I welcome both of you. I'm looking forward to have a great session. So topic today we have is very important since we are going through such a tough time, and still breaches are continuing hitting our organizations, and the data leakage risk is significantly and exponentially going high, and that is impacting organization really bad. Organizations are struggling with data leakage. They try to identify the root cause of the breaches, and there are multiple aspects that involved behind those breaches. What is the right strategy for organization to avoid those breaches? And that's what we are going to discuss today. Our assumption-based security to validation by intelligence-based security. What are those assumptions that we have about our security controls, security processes, and what is the right approach to validate your security controls, your security processes for the effectiveness of your security plan? So organizations are definitely preparing against sophisticated threats and the sophisticated threat landscape. But the usual assumption with organizations that if they implement right tools, technologies, and validation of control, they are secure. But I think that's just assumption because greater tools and technologies definitely help you secure. But the one question is that how you put together all those tools and technologies and what effectiveness you draw from that. So that validation is required to assess the impact of the tools and technologies that you have. So that's what the FireEye and its capability comes in a picture, and we're going to hear from them that what are those assumptions that they're in the security, and how we validate those effectiveness of the security tools, and what is the right approach. First, I will hand over to Steve, who is going to take up and talk about the validation by intelligence-based security. Over to you, Steve. I will give you just a presentation, right, and then you can start from there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just share my screen.
You can share your screen.
All right, I think you can see my screen okay. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the opportunity and from DSCI to present to you all, and thanks to all of you for making the time and choosing to attend the session. So I'll start at a high level understanding of what security validation, security effectiveness, really what it's all about. And today I think this is a problem that lots of organizations, probably maybe even almost every organization, is struggling with. And it's a fundamental problem. It's a really important problem to address. And there's a little bit of history behind it. So let me start and talk about the history. And the history really comes from the security teams finally getting a seat at the business table. Do you all remember back in 2016, 2017, reading articles like this one? Right? Cybersecurity is a business risk, not just an IT problem. A few years ago, it was very much that businesses saw cybersecurity in the domain of IT, that it had nothing to do with business, that it was all about technology. And if there was some cybersecurity impact, that it would impact the IT infrastructure. Maybe a server would go down, maybe a laptop would be inaccessible, but it really didn't have much to do in the way of business. And of course, we in security knew that that wasn't true. We knew that when cyber attacks happen, the consequences aren't consequences on the IT side, they're consequences on the business side. And it took a long time for the business stakeholders to come to terms with that. You know, in some ways, cybersecurity is intimidating. It's very technical. And a lot of the business people didn't want to have to deal with that problem. They just wanted to push it off to the security and the IT teams. Well, a number of years have passed. We're in 2020 now, and we got what we asked for. The majority of organizations now see cybersecurity as a business risk. And so you see boards of directors who are being briefed on cybersecurity. You see regulators who are saying it is the ultimate responsibility, or the responsibility ultimately lies with the executive leadership and with the board of directors when it comes to cybersecurity risk. So that ownership has changed. Really, the whole mindset around cybersecurity and the consequences of cyber attacks has changed quite drastically just in the last few years. So we've made progress. But now the board is aware of this problem, and the board is starting to ask questions, right? This may be the first time that CIOs or CISOs are reporting into the board. And you can imagine that in board meetings, maybe the chief financial officer is presenting to the board, and for every question the board members have, that chief financial officer has a numerical answer, right? He can answer precisely, quantitatively, with evidence, measured evidence, right? And then the CFO finishes, and now it's security's turn, right? And security comes to the board, and the board asks, are we secure? Or maybe they ask, how secure are we? How do you answer that question? How does your organization answer that question, right? In security, we don't necessarily measure that. It's quite hard to measure. We can get anecdotal evidence. We can measure, you know, number of things dropped at the firewall, but those really aren't answers to the question, are we secure? So this is a tough question to answer. And it's not the only question board members are asking. Board members are asking, you know, what about improvement? Is our cybersecurity posture trending up or trending down compared to last quarter? Are we more secure or are we less secure than last quarter? And not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. How much more secure? How much improvement? And do you start to see how answering those questions could be very difficult for most organizations? A lot of organizations aren't measuring things that way. It doesn't mean they're not paying attention to defense. They very much are doing everything they can to defense. They're putting in lots of effort in terms of time and energy and money, but they're not necessarily measuring the effectiveness in a way that can be reported to the business stakeholders. One that's very common, the board says, you know, we've read about an attack in the news. Maybe it's Maze, maybe more recently Egregor, maybe even more recently supply chain attack they've seen in the news. And we're concerned. Is this an attack that puts us as risk? How do organizations answer this question? So we'll talk about this in a few slides. Or what about budget? Right? The board is concerned with budget. And from their perspective, security is a black hole when it comes to budget. It's never ending. The security teams always need to defend against new threats. They're always asking for more money every year. And the board might be thinking, how do we optimize what we already have? But we as security professionals know that we hesitate to take anything out of the environment, because what if that security control we take out is the one security control which would have stopped an attack that would have saved the business. And so it's hard to know without measuring the individual effectiveness of those controls where we have an opportunity to optimize. Or in the year of 2020, you know, maybe it's not optimized, maybe it's reduced. How can we reduce our cybersecurity spend? So all of these questions from the board, you know, we asked to be part of that business conversation. And now security is part of that business conversation. But now we have questions to answer. And I think that's where we're at in 2020, and that's the challenge that security organizations, departments, SOCs are struggling to answer. It's a new type of task. It's not just defend against the attackers. It's quantitate and show through evidence how effective, how good a job you're doing, and how you're trending over time. So to do this, I want to make this session a little bit interactive. And I've created 3 poll questions, right? So you can answer these polls on your mobile phone. So get your mobile phone ready, and I'll put up a QR code. Now, the QR code is just going to take you to a web page. You don't need to install any software. You don't need to download any apps. You don't need to log in. You don't need to even identify yourself, right? So you won't even be typing your name into this web page. So it's an anonymous survey. And when I show the results will be presented in aggregate, right? So no one's individual answers will be seen, right? So you're completely anonymous here. And I just want to get a feel of how you deal with some of these questions around security efficacy and reporting security efficacy. So we'll go through 3 questions and we'll show the answers in real time. So let's take a look at the first question. You can see the QR code here. So feel free to snap that on your camera. I hope a lot of you participate, because the more people who participate, the more interesting the results will be to take a look, right? So we have the question of, how do you know that your security controls are effective? And if you're taken, if you take to this web page, you'll see that there's some multiple choice answer. There's 4 answers, and I'll review the sample answers in just a minute. I'll leave the QR code up a little bit longer, and then we'll take a look at the results, right? But start with the most basic question. How do you, what mechanism, what process do you have in place today to give you confidence that your security controls, and when I say security controls, I mean things like firewall and IPS and antivirus and EDR, MSSPs, right? Anything meant to prevent or detect attacks. How do you know that they're working well? Okay, so let's take a look at the options. I'm going to slide on over here to the question. And here are the options. How do you know that your security controls are effective, right? And so some organizations might say, well, nothing bad has happened, right? So I'm doing a good job, right? So far, no issue. Second option is, well, look, I've spent a lot of time and a lot of money, a lot of energy on cybersecurity. I have so many layers that it has to be secure. Maybe some of you do a penetration test or a red team, maybe once or twice a year. Or number 4, I continuously test and measure security effectiveness with automated attacks that are most relevant for my attack profile based on cyber threat intelligence. So those are the options. So let me give you the QR code one more time in case you want to poll. I saw when I was going over the questions there that some of the responses were rolling in. So again, it'll be more interesting if more of you participate. Okay, let's take a look at the responses. And we've got 14 responses here. Okay, and so no one is saying, well, nothing bad has happened yet, so that's good. That's good news. Some of you, or none of you, are also saying that you're really working on assumptions. A few of you are doing penetration tests or red teams, right? So we've got 2 out of the 15 reporting there, or 3 out of the 16 now. And the majority of you are saying you continuously test and measure. So that's interesting. I'd be interested to see how you're doing that. Are you using in-house tools to do that? Are you using commercial tools to do that? And if you're using in-house tools, where are you getting the various attacks, right? Because number 4, the 4th one, is a good thing to be able to do, but it's not necessarily easy. There's a lot of aspects to it. But that is the idea behind security validation. All right, let's go to question number 2. All right, and again, we have 3 questions. So the second question is, and we have a separate QR code here, so you can snap this QR code, and it's the same process and rules as the last time around for the first question. Given your evidence of security control effectiveness, right, given your answer to the first question, how confident is your business leadership in your organization's security posture? So when the board asks you, how secure are we, and you present the evidence of how secure you are, how satisfied with that answer is your business leadership? Okay, and let's take a look at the answers, the potential answers to that question. So the answers are, well, maybe the board isn't asking how secure you are. So in that case, maybe you're lucky or maybe not, but eventually they will be asking how secure you are. It could be that they're not very confident given the evidence you've given. They might say, look, we need more assurance. You know, what level of assurance can you provide us? They might be moderately confident, or they might be very confident. So let me come back to the QR code one more time to give people a chance to snap that and see the results. And then we can come and take a look at the responses. Okay, we have 11 responses here. And we've got a mix. So no one is saying their board isn't asking. So it's great to see that, again, it's a very different landscape than 2017 when the boards weren't taking responsibility for this. In this case, all of you are saying that, yes, the boards are asking. And we've got a mix, right? We've got the majority of people, about 2/3, saying the board is moderately confident given the response that you give. And 1/3 is saying that they're very confident with the response that you give. So that's interesting, right? If we can compare that to the first question, the majority of you were saying, look, you continuously test and measure, but even with that evidence, the board is saying, well, that's good, but you know, we want to aim to do better, right? So that's quite interesting. All right, let's move on to the third and final question. And we've got, again, a new QR code here, so you can snap this and you'll be taken to the QR code. And this question is not about the board, this question is about you. How effective do you assess your security controls, right? Given all of the things that you've bought and deployed and all the people and processes and technology you have, you know, how effective do you think all of that is against cyber attacks? And so let's take a look at the answers, right? So if you're very confident, you could say that the security controls are over 90% effective, or over 75% effective, or over 50% effective. Or if you're really skeptical, you can say below 50% effective. Or maybe you're not sure how to measure it. So there's a 5th answer there. And so kind of rate, aside from the board, put them to the side for now. But just for yourselves, how confident do you think your security controls are? I'll bring this QR code up again for a few more seconds for people to take a picture and get taken to the poll. And then we can come to the poll results and see what the answers are. Okay, we've got a little more diversity. So only one of you is saying that you believe you're over 90% effective. Some are saying, 5 are saying over 75% effective. You know, 0 are under 50% effective. 2 are saying below 50% effective. And 2 are unsure on how to measure it. So this is quite interesting because we've got a very diverse spread around, you know, how well organizations, while we come back to the second question, or rather the first question, almost everyone is saying, hey, I test and measure this continuously, right? Using real world attacks based on my profile. But only 2 of you are confident over 90% effective that that's working well. So how can we do that testing in a more continuous way that gives both you and the board more confidence? And that's what we want to talk about today. So thanks for everyone who participated in the polls. that ends the interactive portion of this presentation, so you can give your phone a rest, and then I'll just go through a few more points before handing off to my colleague Shash to go into depth around security validation. Well, at FireEye, we wanted to find the answer to this question also, that last poll question. How secure really are these organizations? So we took our validation technology and we dropped it into multiple Fortune 1000 companies. And we put this in their production environment, so it wasn't in a lab environment. It was against their production security controls. And we used real-world attacks, not simulations, right? So the actual threats that attackers would use, we validated the security controls in these organizations for their effectiveness. And what is the result? The result that we measured is that defenses are less than 50% effective in aggregate. So let me try and explain this chart for you. So the first thing you might notice is that the numbers on this pie chart don't add up to 100. And the reason for that is there's some overlap, right? So there is prevented, that means the security control blocked the attack. There's detected, which means the security control generated an alert, but wasn't able to block or stop the attack, but at least it raised an alarm. Alerted is different than detected. Alerted is not coming from a security control, but rather coming from a correlation technology like a SIM, right? So when you correlate events from multiple different types of security controls, you can make additional assessments. So that's alerted. And then missed is it just came right through and nothing alerted or prevented it, right? So when we ran a whole batch of attacks, 53% were missed. Defenses were less than 50% effective. And the reason these numbers don't add up to 100 is because you can have overlap. Something could be alerted and prevented, right? And so there's overlap on the bottom three items there. But the learnings are even very mature security organizations aren't as secure as they think they are, or aren't as secure as they assume that they are. And when you change that assumption to a measurement, it's not to make anyone feel bad, not to make you think that you've invested in the wrong technologies, because a lot of these issues are correctable. A lot of times vendors, when they update to new versions, maybe that version isn't automatically being pushed to the security control. Or if it is being pushed to the security control, maybe that version has new features. Lots of security vendors, by default, when they push out new features, they make those capabilities available, but by default, they're disabled because maybe they consume additional resources on that security device. And we don't know if the device is near capacity or not, right? So it's available, but it's pushed out by default. So very simple things like turning on engines that are optional engines can raise this security efficacy. But before you have to go and tune it, you have to realize there's a problem and understand where those problems are. And that's where the measurement of security validation, security effectiveness comes in. So we work with many customers to take this number of 53, which is a below 50% effective number, and get that much higher. And now when the board asks the question of which direction is our security posture trending in, you can say, well, in November, we were at 53%. But we've done work, we've put a lot of work and effort into it, and the measured effectiveness of how secure this organization is up to 67%. We've identified additional things that we'll be addressing in Q1 of next year to bring that beyond 67%. Right? That's much more of what the board wants to hear, rather than, well, we've run a red test, we found some weaknesses, and we addressed those weaknesses. Right? That's good qualitative information, but doesn't quantify it. So this whole exercise of working with these Fortune 1000 companies and testing their security control effectiveness, we've released a report on that. It's called Deep Dive into Cyber Reality. I put a QR code on it so that you can jump over to that report. It's not a very long report. It is maybe 20 or 30 pages long, and it details this exercise of measuring the effectiveness of these organizations. And when we talk about security effectiveness, we're not just talking about malware here. We're talking about everything in the MITRE attack framework, right? Post-exploitation techniques, things with data exfiltration, any of the building blocks that attackers use to string together an end-to-end attack, those are the things we want to validate, not just vulnerabilities against specific CVEs or malwares. It's really anything an attacker will do. So we walk through those stages of attack in this report, show some common misconfigurations and some common areas for improvement. So there's lots of interesting suggestions for you in this report as well. So the report's freely available. Feel free to snap the QR code if you're interested in learning more about that exercise. Okay, so this is the idea of security validation. Well, what does FireEye and Mandiant have in the way to help with security validation, right? And this is the idea of, again, not assuming, it's about measuring. And what's really important to understand is what security validation is trying to do, what it is and what it's not. And it's really important to stress what security validation is not. Security validation is not itself a security control, right? So security controls, again, they are things which detect or block attacks. This is your firewall, your IPS, your antivirus, your EDR, your NDR, your SIM, right? Anything that generates an alert, anything that finds evil in your network is a security control. And the way most organizations deploy security controls is you don't just have one security control. There's lots of different use cases. And so you have many security controls. You stack them all, and we call that defense in depth, okay? So security validation doesn't participate in that effort. Security validation is not generating alerts about attackers attacking your environment. It's not blocking attackers. Security validation is all about measuring the effectiveness of your security controls, right? So at the end of this presentation, I always get a question like, well, can security validation detect X? Well, no, the answer is no, it can't, because it's not trying to detect that. It is measuring the effectiveness of security controls. Another way to think about it is almost like a QA department, quality assurance, right? So how do you have a maker-checker model, right? So you have the security teams which are building this infrastructure, and then security validation is a tool which can allow you to continually test the effectiveness of those security controls. And at FireEye, our solution is called Mandiant Security Validation. So let's look at some use cases, and I have 2 use cases prepared for you. The first use case is a headline fire drill. Anyone who's been in cybersecurity for any period of time has experienced this before. There's a headline news. It usually happens at Friday at 5 p.m. and it's really bad security news. And usually some organization is impacted and makes the headlines. And all of the organizations who care about security or maybe are in the same industry, look at that headline and they wonder, am I safe against what happened to this company? So you can think about WannaCry, you can think about NotPetya, all of these events. So when you have these events like this, let's take a recent one, right? So CERT India, for example, warned Indian companies about this egregor new ransomware, right? So when the bosses and the business leaders see this, what are they going to do? Naturally, they're going to ask, I read about this in the news. Is this something we have covered? And what do you all do as security professionals to answer that question? How do you answer it? Because the question comes every few weeks or every few months. There's something new in the headlines, and the business wants to know, for what we saw in the headlines, are we safe? How do we answer? Well, I can tell you my understanding of what a lot of organizations do, because we are coming from a vendor perspective. A lot of our customers call us up and not just FireEye, but any security control vendor. And they will pass that question off to their security vendor and say, are the security controls that I bought from you, are they effective against this specific threat that my management is asking about? Well, that's one way to do it, but the vendor will reply, yes, we have protections, yes, there's signatures, but there's also variables in there, right? What about your specific configuration of that security control? What about your specific environment? Is the security control really seeing all the right traffic it needs to analyze and detect that threat? The traffic placement. What about the modules that I mentioned? Have you turned on all the right modules? So there's lots of these things which are variables, which maybe aren't factored in to that vendor reply. So how can you get a more concrete answer? Are you safe against this new type of ransomware? So here is Mandiant Security Validation. Here's a screenshot of the actual interface. The company that we acquired is called Veridin, so that's why you see Veridin in the title there. But what this security engineer has done is he's gotten that question from his management, and he's gone into security validation and typed in egregor and wants to know, what are the specific real-world attacks that I can validate in my environment against my security controls with my specific configuration, and see if they are detected or prevented or blocked or missed. And when we filter on those actions, we can see that there's one action here for egregor ransomware, and it is a file transfer action. Now, this is not a simulation. This is passing the actual threat. So we know definitively if the security control is able to stop this threat or not as it transfers through the network. But there's also a test for endpoint security controls, because network security controls may be looking for one type of way to detect this problem. Endpoint security controls look for different aspects to detect this problem. And so we have both. And so what we can do is simply play this attack safely and securely in the environment against what we call dedicated actors, but passing through the production security controls and get a definitive answer on which security controls in the stack were able to see or block this. Now you can answer with confidence. When the board asks you that question, are you secure? We can say, Mandiant Security Validation has this most recent threat intelligence. It is available in the tool. We use that threat intelligence to replay the attack against our live production security controls. And here's the screenshot of our security control catching that threat and generating an alarm or blocking the threat in some way. We've actually gone to the work of actually testing this, not asking somebody, but actually testing it in our environment. And again, the security controls you're testing here, not just FireEye security controls. This can be any security control from any vendor. Let's look at a second use case. Okay, and this is focusing on response to an intrusion. Let's say your Security Operations Center has detected a successful intrusion. Attackers have broken into your network, and the SOC has a good threat intelligence team, and they're able to, based on the evidence that they see, attribute this intrusion to Fin11, which is a sophisticated, financially motivated cybercrime actor. This actor is now in your network. It's been discovered, and your job is to figure out what happened, what to do about it, and to kick that attacker out of your network. So what the Security Operations Center has seen is Fin11 activity is identified as internal reconnaissance. In other words, the attacker was scanning the inside of your network to try and understand what resources are there to potentially progress their attack. Now, we like to align this to the MITRE attack framework. right? So the MITRE attack framework isn't so focused on categorizing malware. It's focused on categorizing TTPs, things attackers do. And so the SOC here has said, you know, we see that what Fin11 was doing was MITRE attack tactic TA0007, which is discovery. And the specific technique that they were using to do this discovery was T1087, account discovery. They were looking to see what sort of privileged accounts they could compromise, or even before compromise, just simply what privileged accounts existed in the environment so that they could further their attack. So yes, an intrusion has been successful, but the end goal of the attack is not yet successful. The attack is still ongoing. Your SOC team has done a good job, has caught it, and now it's a race to stop the attackers before they complete their mission. Well, when we look at MITRE attack, and if you haven't looked at MITRE attack, I encourage you to look at it. It's a wonderful tool for enumerating all of the various things that attackers can do in an environment. So roughly across the top, you see the stages of the attack: reconnaissance, initial access, persistence, credential access, lateral movement, and then those are the tactics. And then below those are the techniques, right? Those are the ways, different ways that attackers have to achieve that tactic. And so what we see here is that tactic discovery, which is what the SOC saw. And we saw there's many different ways to do discovery. We see what Fin11 was doing was account discovery, right? And what is it that once they discover accounts, what is it they're going to do next? Well, they'll do lateral movement next. And there's a lot of ways that MITRE says attackers can achieve lateral movement. So as a defender who's in a race against time against Fin11, which one of these do I focus on? Right? Where do I focus my efforts? Well, that's where threat intelligence comes in. Threat intelligence isn't always about IP addresses or hashes or URLs, things that you want to block. Sometimes threat intelligence is about TTPs. It's about understanding which threat actors attack in which ways so that you can head them off and you can beat them in that race against time. So this is another tool from FireEye called Mandiant Advantage. This is our threat intelligence portal. And here the defender has searched for Fin11. We've got a report on this threat actor called Fin11. So we can click on that and we can see all sorts of information about Fin11, right? Yes, we have indicators like hashes and URLs, domains and IPs. We can see the different public reporting, what this Fin11 group is reported as or named as by other vendors, what industries they target. But let's take a look, and of course we can download those indicators, but let's take a look at MITRE attack for Fin11. When we click on this, we'll be taken to that MITRE attack graph, but this is a filtered graph. So we still see the tactics in each row and the techniques below each column. And it may be a little bit smaller to see, but this is a subset. These are the attacks we've observed Fin11 using, and that Fin11 is more likely to use again. Right? So here is the account discovery, right, under Tactic 7, discovery. And remember what we anticipated them to do next was lateral movement. But here we see that Fin11 prefers one single technique for lateral movement. Okay? So we can now focus on that, and that is number T1021. That's the number of the technique. And we might want to say, go back to this validation question of, are we secure against T1021? This is the technique that Fin11 uses for lateral movement. So we come back to Mandiant security validation, and we put in T1021. We want to know, would our defenses see Fin11's next move, right, based on the evidence we have? This brings up actions, and you can see there's 3 actions here. The top action in the description is specifically calling out FIN11, so that gives us some confidence that this is all gelling. And then we can play this action in our environment, and we can see, are security controls effective against what could be FIN11's next move? We can do that very, very quickly, right? And so this is another way that we can use, rather than assumption-based security, evidence of security effectiveness, even in an active attack. Now, I showed you a couple of tools there. One of the tools was a threat intelligence portal called Mandiant Advantage. We have a freemium version of Mandiant Advantage, and so I put a QR code to the right of the Mandiant Advantage logo here, and you can register for Mandiant Advantage at no cost. And this freemium version will give you specific information. It's got some information about FIN11. It's got some information that is been in the news just this week. So you'll have access to some of the threat intelligence, but it's a freemium level of access, right? You may see other things which then require a higher level or a purchased access. But the freemium access is, I would say, quite good and provides a lot of useful information, and it is a useful tool in any security defender's belt, and it doesn't cost anything. So I'd encourage you all to register for Mandiant Advantage, freemium version. Take a look at it, and hopefully it can aid you in your defensive operations. The other security tool we looked at here was Mandiant Security Validation. I put a QR code there as well. This is the tool, again, not which is trying to detect attacks, but rather a tool which issues attacks against production security controls to measure their effectiveness. Okay? And we gave a few examples there, but there's actually thousands of actions in Mandiant Security Validation to test almost anything you can think of across the MITRE attack framework. So that is an introduction of Mandiant Security Validations. I'll pause here in case there's any questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And if there's any questions, I'll try and answer them for you before we pass the session on to my colleague, Shash, to do a little bit more of a deep dive on Mandiant Security Validation. So Vivek, any questions from the audience I can answer before passing to Shash?
Yeah, thanks to you for the nice presentation. So as of now, I don't see any questions. So I request audience, if you have any questions, you can post it into the chat. We'll take that questions. If you have any question for Steve.
I think we'll have an opportunity at the end of the workshop as well to ask questions. So think through on the presentation content I've just given, and as Shash is going through, think of any questions, and at the end we'll be happy to try and answer any questions that you have as well. If there's no questions now, maybe I will pass it on to Shash to continue a little bit more in depth on Mandiant Security Validation.
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. Now I will give the rights to Shash. Just 1 minute. So, Shash, are you logging from the console 5? I can't see your name over here.
I'm logged in as Shash.
Yeah, now I got it. Yeah, so now you can present, Shash. You can share your screen.
Just let me know when my screen is visible, and I'll get started.
Yeah, visible.
Awesome. Well, good day, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shash. Well, actually, it's Shash, and I think Indians can on the name. I am a solutions architect based out of Singapore, and and I think some of you are familiar with me. We've had conversations before. If not, this is a good opportunity for us to speak at the end of this workshop. What we want to do, what we want to cover as part of this session, hopefully in the next 30 to 45 minutes, is a little more deeper understanding of some of the concepts that were highlighted by Steve earlier today, right? And for the few minutes, what we will do is we will look at one attack type, and we'll break down that attack into multiple steps. Because when you think about how an attacker typically attacks an organization, they are actually, if it's a sophisticated attacker, the attacker takes a lot of time to go after the organization. And they have multiple tactics, multiple tools, multiple procedures that they're actually going to execute within that specific environment that they're targeting. Now, as a defender, if you were to think about this, there is a structured framework of thought that you can potentially apply to break down this attacker's methodologies. And there are various frameworks that exist for this. One is the attack lifecycle framework that was introduced by Mandiant a few years ago. A most common one was your kill chain framework that everybody knows and talks about all the time. And most recently now we have the attack framework. Now, for the purpose of our conversation, we will stick with MITRE ATT&CK framework, because this has now become the industry standard, and every product in the industry is actually using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And as Steve had highlighted previously, most of our methodologies that we use on our platform is actually using the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? So that's what we're going to use for the rest of the conversation. A couple of housekeeping items. I may go back and forth between Veteran Mandiant Security Validation, or MSV. That's because we're still getting used to the name change. We actually acquired this company last year around May, and we just rebranded the name of the product from Veteran to Mandiant Security Validation. So I may go back and forth between the two terms, so don't get confused. Just bear with me when I do that, right? Now, the fundamental point that I think Steve tried to convey previously was, security in general is based on a few assumptions, right? And I want to highlight those 4 assumptions just to introduce how we kind of do validation at a high level before we dive into some of the technical nitty-gritties. So the first point I'll cover is, what are those assumptions? Because when we started looking at the various assumptions that organizations are making in terms of their security deployments or the security investments, we actually narrowed it down to 4 primary assumptions. So the first assumption is that we assume, that the product that we've deployed in our environment, they actually work as the vendors claim that they work. If you go back, Steve has this example where he talks about, what's the first thing that you do when somebody from your board or somebody from your executive department actually asks you, how well are you prepared against this attack that's making the rounds on the news headlines? And the first thing that you do is actually you call the vendor to figure out the vendor is actually covering that specific threat vector, right? So, and one of the fundamental reasons why you do that is because you're already assuming that the vendor is kind of providing, or the vendor's product is actually providing you with enough protections as the vendor claims. You are not necessarily investing the time to validate that by yourselves within your environment, right? And that assumption leads to a lot of issues as we've uncovered over the last few years. The second assumption is, again, something that goes back to Steve's point, which is the issue around product configuration as well as product deployment. Now, most often, when we do POV and engagements with different vendors, we actually check that deployment in a very small environment. It's not a production environment. It's easy to kind of deploy things in there. But when a product is deployed in production, especially enterprise networks, which are very complex, multiple teams that are involved, the deployment will usually have certain gaps. And organizations don't get the opportunity to actually validate those deployments because everybody's running from one project to the other, and they want to quickly finish up this deployment project as soon as possible. So because of these kinds of issues, you end up in situations where you don't have the right product updates, you've not downloaded the recent update, or you made a mistake when you know it, but you don't know about it, or sometimes you've not even configured it properly, it's just misconfigured, right? And that leads to a lot of issues as well. But organizations make this assumption that all of this is actually working properly, and that leads to problems also. The third issue is something that goes back to the age-old adage of security, which is, we talk about people, process, and technology, right? So this is a very people-centric problem, where we believe that, just because we have a team of 10 security experts on board, they are actually predicting the signals properly, they have the right skill sets, etc. It's not a bad reflection on the people, but everybody needs to upskill as well. Everybody also sometimes do not have the right amount of time to actually deal with everything that is happening inside an environment. So let's say you take a proper, well-functioning SOC that works around the clock. Typically, if they're monitoring at least 1,000 systems, they're going to see at least 1,000 alerts on a daily basis. And if you have a team of 10 people, you really think those 10 people are going to go through all those 1,000 alerts that exist on that specific day? It's absolutely not possible. So you need a system of prioritization, you need some sort of system that actually helps you understand what are the right alerts in there. And because of issues such as these, most often, things that are really important, they get missed. Right? This is an age-old SOC problem. So that's the third option. And the fourth assumption that we see very commonly is something that happens through changes that are happening inside an organization. So if you think about an enterprise network, typically there are multiple teams that are handling different kinds of infrastructure. So there is a network team that's responsible for all of your networking infrastructure. There is an endpoint team that is responsible for all of your endpoint security technologies. There is an Active Directory team that is only responsible for taking care of Active Directory infrastructure, for instance. And then there is a team that is responsible for Firewall. Now, each of those teams often are not necessarily communicating their changes to the other teams. And because of that, when one team makes a change, that actually impacts the overall security of that environment that all of these four teams are responsible for. Unfortunately, the responsibility of that infrastructure, or the security responsibility of infrastructure, kind of rests on the security team itself. And because the security team is not well informed about this, usually they are kind of interested in the changes that are happening. And because of those changes, sometimes there are additional gaps that are introduced into the environment that leads to something bad, like a breach or a compromise. So these four assumptions kind of quantify the problem that we want to solve through this validation product. And that is what we aim to do with these acquisitions that we made last year and with some of the new enhancements that we've built into the product. And that is why we call it as validation, because we want to validate your assumptions. At the same time, we want to also kind of provide you with some kind of assurance that your investments are actually bearing fruit, right? That you're actually, in fact, doing the right thing. That you can actually confidently go back to your management or your board with quantifiable data that you can produce as evidence to say that, yes, I can say with 90% certainty that, our investments are actually good, our security risk posture is actually pretty good, and we are doing the right thing as opposed to somebody else, right? So how does it work? One more slide before I get into the nitty-gritty, so bear with me. So it works through a system of 4 to 5 steps, and then it kind of works in a circular manner once we've established those 4 steps. So the first step is basically try to identify and understand what are these security investments that you've made within your environment from a technology standpoint. So we look at your security tech stack or the security technology portfolio, and we deploy our technology around them and continuously kind of run these attacks or these tests, as you call it, to see how effectively they are responding to these attack vectors or these tests that they're running. And by virtue of doing this comprehensively, we are able to paint a picture of what is your current standing, where do you stand today, what is your baseline, right? So we establish that baseline first by running these basic tests that we across your environment to figure out how are you currently doing, where are the gaps. So once we've identified this gap, what we do next is through the technology itself, and sometimes by virtue of a little bit of consulting from our side, basically help you figure out how do you kind of optimize that stack. So let's say you're at 60%. How do you get from 60% to 70% in the next 3 months or the next quarter, right? That is the optimization that we provide through the technology itself by virtue of recommendations. And what we do here is we fall back on MITRE ATT&CK framework again. And most recently, we just introduced NIST framework as well. So what we do here is first we assess from MITRE ATT&CK standpoint itself, what you're doing, where are your gaps, and then through the MITRE ATT&CK framework itself, there is a secondary framework called the MITRE ATT&CK mitigation framework. We use that mitigation framework to provide recommendations. Sometimes we also collect evidence from your own environment and tell you, hey, there are certain things that you've not enabled within your existing technology, and here are the things that you should probably enable, which will address the issue that we've discovered. But overall, we kind of provide these recommendations that help you optimize your existing stack from your baseline to something better than that. Once you've done that, what we also want to do is we want to identify, where are the areas where you have opportunity for rationalization. So for instance, I've worked with customers where they have multiple firewalls within their environment, and they want to go through an exercise. They want to consolidate that to maybe one firewall vendor, or they want to consolidate all of those things where they realize that they have 2 or 3 technologies that have overlapping functionalities, and they want to consolidate all of that into maybe 1 or 2 technologies, right? So they want to reduce the spending and optimize that. It's very hard to make that decision. Again, this goes back to the points that Steve made, where you're scared that if you remove one of the technologies from your environment, you don't know what's going to happen, because you don't know how effective it is, and you don't know what it is necessarily blocking or not necessarily blocking. And so to help you make that decision in a quantifiable way, in a way that actually makes sense to you as an organization, we have a rationalization capability on the product as well, where what we do is we rank your existing products based on kind of attack vectors that we've executed inside your environment, and we tell you which product is doing better than the other, and which products actually have overlapping technologies or overlapping functionalities, and how do you use that data to kind of make that decision to say, I'm actually comfortable getting rid of one product here, and this is the product that I choose to get rid of from my environment, and these are the other 2 products where I'm going to invest further, right? So that's our rationalization capability. That's also built into the product, which we kind of help organizations with. And the final piece is, once all of this is kind of done, the organization typically is in a better position to say that they're comfortable with where they stand based on all of these findings that they've put together using our technology. And then what they want to do from that on is to continuously validate that that specific baseline is getting better over a period of time. And we do that by virtue of defining what your environment looks like, and how do you kind of go from there? How do you get better from that point on? So we do that by continuously, frequently, or on a frequency that is kind of defined by the organization itself. Let's say it could be a weekly frequency or a monthly frequency or a quarterly frequency. Whatever that frequency is that is defined by the organization, we kind of run attacks or these tests against a defined environment to measure your effectiveness or improvement in your effectiveness over a period of time. Right? So that's, in a nutshell, the philosophy as to how we do it and the methodology that we do this. Now I'm going to move to the more interesting pieces, which is how do we actually do this in practice using our technology. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly introduce my environment, right? So assume that my environment kind of looks like this, where what you have is a small replica of a typical enterprise network, where you have multiple segments that are basically defined, right? So you have an internet segment from where users are going and they're browsing towards some asset on the internet, or they're communicating by sending emails to other people outside organization, etc. And then you have organizational assets that are inside your network that are defined through segmentation practices as zones. So you have a business zone, you have a server zone, you have a use zone, maybe you have a DMZ where you have you're forcing certain traffic to go through those some of the technologies that you defined there, etc. So if this is the structure, and if you are using those or a family of products that is basically protecting this network, if I were an attacker, and if I were to attack this a specific asset within your network outside the internet, how would I kind of do this? That's the first thing to think about, and this is what we're going to replicate in our demo as well when we go through some of the pieces, some of the technical pieces of the workshop. So let's assume that we have an attacker that is based outside on the internet, and we have a victim or like a target that is kind of inside your network. Now, if I were to attack this, I have a few options. I could try to send a spear phishing email to the user. or I could try to get the user to click on a specific link that is potentially malicious. And there are various ways of channels through which you can do this. WhatsApp, or you can use a collaborative tool like Teams or like Slack or whatever it is that organizations use these days, where you have a link and somebody just clicks on it and boom, they compromise, right? Or I can just send a spear phishing email that's got a malicious attachment, and then they download that attachment, try to open it, and they can't get compromised. Whatever the way is, there's multiple ways to do this, but the traffic or the flow of traffic is going to potentially be from outside the internet to inside your network. When that is happening, if you look at this from the perspective of, what are your security controls doing when this traffic is going through the wire, you notice that all of these security controls get an opportunity to inspect that traffic and block it, or inspect that traffic and just trigger some kind of a detection alert, or inspect that traffic and log some activity, send those logs to a SIEM, and get the SIEM to do some kind of a response. Maybe generate an alert or send a notification to somebody within the SOC, right? You also notice here within the diagram that once it lands, once that payload or once that attack vector lands on the target also you have some security technologies. You have some endpoint technologies that could be an antivirus kind of a technology, an ER kind of technology, or a DL kind of a technology, right? So technologies also have an opportunity to kind of respond to this. So our methodology is in basically evaluating all of these technologies that exist along the way that potentially forms what is known as your tech stack, your security tech stack. And we want to know how effective each of these technologies are when we run different kinds of attacks. So this is just an example of an attack that is executed from outside the internet to some user who's inside the network. It could be either a spear phishing email, or it could be like a drive-by download compromise, right? But there are others that you can execute as well. You could do lateral movement. You could do, command and control. You could do data exfiltration. There's lots of things that kind of fall into that MITRE attack framework you could potentially execute using the technology. So in our workshop, or for the next few 30 minutes or whatever time that we have, we will kind of follow this model. And what I'll do is I'll go back into the architectural setup as well as our tool itself to show you various stages of the MITRE attack framework that we're basically going to execute as attacks within that demo environment that we'll use for the workshop. All right. So when I was thinking about what scenario should we use to kind of break down from an attack standpoint, I realized that this is the year of ransomware. So it's an obvious choice. So we'll pick ransomware itself as an example here. And one of the common issues is when we talk about ransomware, most organizations think, all right, so I just want to know if that ransomware can be executed on my system and if my systems are actually blocking it. But this year being the year of the ransomware, a few things have changed. Ransomwares don't work like that anymore. They don't take that shotgun approach. They're a little more sophisticated. There are a lot of ransomware operators now, especially that have come out this year, that are kind of employing this methodology where they're taking a more APT-centric approach than as opposed to the previous shotgun approach where they would just try to compromise the users. They don't care who's actually getting compromised. They'll just lock that system up and then try to ask for ransom, right? So that approach is no longer working. In general, it doesn't make that much sense for the attackers. So what they do now is they kind of go for specific sets within the organization and then kind of execute the ransomware there. So as a defender, it gives you a lot of opportunities to catch the attacker because the attacker is going through various stages. So you have opportunities to catch the attacker at multiple stages. And if you are able to do that, then you can kind of disrupt the chain, or you can disrupt the attacker before the attacker is able to execute their final mission of executing the ransomware. So we'll kind of break this down as part of this workshop. So the first thing to understand is what's happening is the way these ransomwares are working is kind of changed. So previously, what you see on the left side is, it was a very shotgun kind of an approach, as I mentioned. There would be there would be like hundreds of thousands of emails that would have been sent to like various users within an organization. They will open it and they will just get compromised. So you'll have like thousands of systems that are locked by ransomware. Organization, when they eventually do a cost analysis of how much is it going to cost them to kind of replace those laptops versus the amount of bitcoins or maybe cryptocurrencies this ransomware operator is asking for, they realize that it's actually more economical for them to just replace those 1,000 systems and then get back to normal with their business. Right, so when, from an attacker's perspective, if you think about this, it doesn't make economic sense. It makes more sense for them to go after a specific target that's got something important for the organization, and if they have locked that up, then there is an impact to the business. So if there is an impact to the business, they have more leverage in terms of demanding a higher ransom in terms of payment from that specific organization. So that's what you see now on the right side, which is the approach has changed. They compromise the user, definitely, but then from that point on, they actually move slowly, identify where your critical assets are within the organization, get in there. They actually steal that data also these days, and then eventually deploy the ransomware. Now, you may ask, why are they stealing this data? Well, there are a few advantages over there as well. So one of the things is they can actually use that data to expose that data on the internet, or they can sell that data to somebody else on the internet. There's multiple things that an attacker can do with your data once you own it. So if you think of this, you realize that there are two things happening. One, they are stealing data from your environment, right? And the second piece is they are deploying ransomware on your critical assets. So as a defender, now you have two things to worry about. So first, you have to stop data exfiltration, and then the second piece is you have to stop that ransomware being executed. So let's look at how this is actually happening, right? So before that, there's not just one ransomware that's actually doing this. I'm calling them a vendor because they typically have a business process that works like as if it's a business. And I'll show and make a very good example of this, where they actually have a shaming website where they post everything that they've stolen from an organization's network. And sometimes they also have like the support people who actually communicate with their victims through that specific website. So it almost works like a business. And it's not just something that one ransomware operator does. There's actually a lot of copycats. There's also a lot of previously existing ransomware operators that have kind of picked up on this trend, and they're kind of executing the same behavior now in 2020. Who knows what's going to happen in 2021? So what we'll do for the rest of this is we'll pick one of these guys, one of these ransomwares, and we kind of break it down step by step to see how you can potentially, first of all, deconstruct the attack to understand how it works, and then reconstruct it and kind of execute that in an environment, potentially your production environment, to see how effective you are in defending against it, right? So what we're going to pick up for this is we'll pick up group ransomware, pretty much. So we'll kind of break it down in terms of their methodologies as to how they potentially execute their models, their specific behaviors in an organization when they compromise that. And we'll see how we can kind of reconstruct it once we've done that. So the first thing that they do is they actually start with a spear phishing email, right? So this is a very common thing. If you think about most compromises, 90% of the times, attackers actually start with a spear phishing email. And there is always going to be one user who's going to fall for it, no matter how many times you've kind of trained them, or you've taken safeguarding steps within your environment. There will always be one compromise in the environment. So that's really what they're relying on, that one user who makes a mistake. And these days, especially, spear phishing emails are so well written, so well constructed that it's very hard to actually know that it's a spear phishing email, unless you're super paranoid. So now, if you think about this spear phishing email, what's happening really is it's got an attachment in it, and the user, if the user is unsuspecting, they will actually download this attachment and they'll try to open it. So one of the things, among the many techniques that ransomware operators use, is that attachment actually has a PowerShell script. So it basically calls on PowerShell within the system. So if you were to think about it, before that PowerShell script is actually executed, when this email is going through the wire into your network, which is the technology that actually comes in the picture to block this. Right? There are two things. Right? One is either your network security technology or your email secure gateway, or maybe your email APD solution, depending on how you kind of deploy your network. But if you don't enforce it to go through a network security technology, at the least it is going to go through your email security gateway first, or your anti-APD email kind of a solution first, before it actually lands on the user's endpoint. So if you are to test this in your environment, what you're really testing is the effectiveness of your email APD solution, or maybe your email secure gateway. Right? We'll get to the testing piece, but just keep that in mind for now. So it starts with an email. When the email comes in, you get an opportunity to validate the effectiveness of your email security gateway, or whatever the email security solution is. Now, once that happens, and let's say the user, the email landed on the user system, the user opened that attachment, and the attachment basically has macros. When you enable those macros, it basically calls on PowerShell. So PowerShell is another common thing that attackers use all the time. Now, I'm seeing a lot of my clients actually disabling PowerShell on low-value systems, because they realize that those users don't necessarily need to have PowerShell enabled on their systems, so they just disable it by default. But some organizations don't have that kind of a policy. It means on every low-value systems, you still see PowerShell something that is enabled for the users. So if that is the case, what happens is, if PowerShell is called, in this case, if root ransomware, the operator's specific attachment actually is calling on PowerShell, it is basically going to execute a script. Now, if you were to now think about this from a deeper standpoint, which is the technology that actually comes into the picture here, stopping this, something on the endpoint, right? Because PowerShell is a tool that is available by default on your like your Windows endpoint. So the only tool now that is really going to come into the picture in terms of detection or prevention is some security tool that is on that endpoint, and that is typically your antivirus solution, or your EDR kind of solution. Right? The other thing to think about here is if you look at the script that is being executed, it just looks like a bunch of text that makes no sense. Right? That's because they've kind of encoded it, and that text is not human readable. And even if you've kind of captured this on some tool, let's say an EDR tool that actually captures command line instructions, it's not very obvious as to what is going on. So you need to investigate to figure out what is really going on here. What's really going on is this PowerShell script is basically downloading a piece of malware called Emotet. Now, Emotet, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but Emotet, is a modular malware which basically downloads multiple modules, and each module has different capabilities. Its primary purpose is, of course, to kind of steal credentials, mostly credentials like usernames and passwords, and more as malware that is targeting financial organizations and financial institutions. But typically what it does is, once it's downloaded, it will download another module for itself by communicating with its C2 server. And whenever it downloads these additional modules, those modules are not really written to disk. They're actually basically just held in memory, and they're loaded from memory itself. If you think about that also, if you try to visualize which security tool is actually going to help you in this case, again, something that you have on your endpoint, and something that has the capability to read these things that are being loaded onto memory. So a typical AV will not really be able to catch this. You would need an advanced tool like an EDR that has memory forensics capability that is potentially going to be able to detect this, right? So that's what we are going to see here. So let's assume that the attacker here, root ransomware operator, has been successful in kind of going through these two steps. So what they're going to do is, through PowerShell, they're going to download Emotet, right? And you have an opportunity now to stop that additional module from being downloaded to the wire. So the first opportunity that is because it is communicating with the C2 server, and through the C2 server is actually downloading this specific module, your perimeter solutions that are on the network, they have the first right of refusal or first opportunity to kind of detect or block this technology. Basic ones are your firewalls, your IDSs, your IPSs, etc., or even a web security gateway if you have one. But an advanced one would be like an NDR tool or a network APT or network anti-APT solution that is looking at the specific attachment or the specific module that's being downloaded or the payload that's being downloaded and analyze it in real time before it actually makes it to the endpoint. Right? So those are the technologies that you'll potentially be evaluating by kind of testing this. Right? What happens after this? So after this, what happens is Emotet will download, as I mentioned previously, it downloads its own module. So that additional module is basically TrickBot. So TrickBot is something that is downloaded by Emotet, and once it's downloaded, it is looking at a few things in terms of enumerating users' information, system information, etc. Sometimes, in rare cases, we've seen that it also does a little bit of mining, crypto mining, and the one that they like to use is Monero. And there's lots of reasons why they use Monero. I won't get into it, but you know, that's the cryptocurrency of choice that they typically use. Now, again, if you were to think about this from a defender standpoint, so which technologies come into the picture when this is being downloaded? So where is this being downloaded from? It's actually being downloaded from the internet. So anything that is going to the wire, anything that is infecting the wire is basically going to come into the picture. So you have your usual suspects of firewalls, or NDS that typically feature in terms of protecting this. So that's the step for Rook, right? So as you can see, it's not as simple as one file download and then execution of that file. There's a lot going on under the hood. So let's keep going until we get to the end. So the next step is once TrickBot is downloaded, you basically potentially put together a payload on that system itself by downloading multiple modules separately. And if for some reason none of your tools have blocked it or detected this, the attacker at this point has the opportunity to put all of this together. And once they put it together, TrickBot basically executes itself. So what does it do when it executes itself? So before we look at that, which technology is going to come into the picture when it executes itself on the system? So if you think about this, the execution is happening on the endpoint, which means anything that you have on the endpoint will come into the picture. So that is your AV or your EDR solutions, right? So if for some reason they're not able to detect this, the attacker will move on to the next stage. So what does TrickBot do? The TrickBot typically, it's kind of like a, it's to protect against getting about systems. It's more commonly used for capturing credentials from a system, from a user, or from a user systems. Now, most of the times when we think about a credential capturing tool, we usually think about Mimikatz. Mimikatz is kind of pretty common now, and everybody knows, and everybody has a way of stopping it. But advanced attackers know something like that. They create something that is, that is very custom made, or they would use, and it's one of those custom made malwares that was created by these ransomware operators that potentially does something a little more advanced than what Mimikatz would do. It's also been known recently to kind of capture credentials that enable the attacker to kind of compromise PuTTY sessions, RDP sessions, BNC sessions. They even sometimes capture users' details through browsers. So it's kind of like a plugin on the browser where what it does is it looks at active sessions. So if you have like a secure token that you've established with some kind of a website or some kind of an internal website, they basically capture that session or that session token, which helps them to kind of compromise your session itself, replicate that separately, and then get access to systems that you have access to. Right? So that's the level of sophistication of TrickBot. So TrickBot also, as I mentioned, it is one of these tools that kind of downloads modules. So it usually goes after credentials, valid credentials that users have. So, but when it is downloading these modules or this from outside the network, when that specific payload is against your network, your typical network solutions come into the picture: firewall, NDR, etc. Right. So again, that's the sixth step where you have an opportunity to detect that this attacker has gone through all these steps already the attacker is kind of, a little more an advanced stage, and you have an opportunity to block them if any of your tools can actually block it. So when in your testing methodology, these are the things that you should potentially look at, and not just the final payload, right? So that's the point I'm trying to highlight here. So let's say all of this has been done. What happens next? Now the attacker changes their tactics a little bit. So what they do is, because now through Checkbot, if they're successful on that user system, they've actually successfully stolen credentials from the user system. So what does the attacker do once they've stolen credentials? They actually use those credentials to kind of move around with the environment, right? More often than not, they get access to not just a regular user's credentials. They sometimes get access to some credential that has higher privileges, and this is what they really need to go after systems that are not necessarily accessible to that specific user, but to somebody with higher privileges, like an administrator. And so what they usually do is they use another tool that helps them use these stolen credentials to access those targeted systems, those high-value systems. And typically, they are some kind of a server that is located somewhere else. And the tool that group ransomware operators use is PSExec. PSExec is, again, another living off the land kind of a tool, which is available by default on systems. Most organizations do not disable this. It's available, which means anybody who has access to that system, they can potentially use PSExec. And the attacker, in this case, potentially uses this tool to remotely access that value system, server, where you have critical information. And they do that using these credentials. The other reason why they use PSExec is PSExec also helps you transfer files from one to another. So, for instance, in this case, let's say through these multiple downloads of modules, the attacker has been successful in putting together the final payload of the ransomware on that system. What they do is, using PSExec and these stolen credentials, they actually move that ransomware file from that compromised system to that remote system where you have something sensitive stored. Now, once they've moved that file to that remote system, what is they kind of also move the data that exists on that system, exfiltrate that data from that system to the compromised system and out of the network. And once all of that is done, they basically buy or execute the ransomware. Now, if all of that is done, you still have opportunity as a defender to kind of detect and stop the attacker. So the first thing that comes in the picture here is, of course, your lateral movement detection tools. So your NDR kind of tools. More often than not, we've seen that firewalls, even though there are firewalls between two internal systems, those firewalls are not necessarily in a position to block this kind of attack. So you need some kind of tool that has the capability to kind of understand lateral movement, protocols that are used typically for lateral movement, etc., to kind of to catch the attacker when the attacker is doing this. So let's say you failed to do this. What is your last step, your final piece of defense that you have to kind of stop the attacker? As I mentioned, we have to eventually, once the ransomware file is kind of moved to that high-value system, they execute that ransomware file. So before they execute it, your final line of defense is basically the endpoint security tools that you have deployed on that specific system, like a server or data or whatever it is. You typically have some AV and maybe you have an EDR, right? So that would be your final step, and they will either block this or not block it, but have some kind of a detection, right? So that's your final step. Now, if you were to put all of these steps together to kind of enumerate the attacker's tactics, right, you can actually see that you can kind of tie it back to the MITRE ATT&CK framework and say that, all right, I understand now that root ransomware operators, they don't necessarily just do one thing, they actually do many things, and those can be broken down through a systematic thinking process, which is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And by looking at this from a MITRE ATT&CK standpoint, or that frame standpoint, I can actually deconstruct and reconstruct the attack and potentially figure out where the attacker is when they're kind of moving around within my environment, even though they've compromised my environment, right? So you have an opportunity to block them, to disrupt that kill chain before that ransomware file is executed. But most of the times when we see organizations, the common misconception is that, when you think about a ransomware, defending your organization from a ransomware, they only think about that final step, that last step, where they think that as long as, let's just see if we have a sample for it. If we don't have a sample for it, let's give us a signature for it, and let's just see if our AV or our EDR is actually able to stop this or catch it, right? And that is, you're kind of missing the point if you take that approach, because you're missing the fact that there are a lot of other steps in between through which you can potentially stop the attacker. Because if you're able to catch them at step 3 or step 4 or uneven, you're really stopping, damages that could be employed within your environment through step 8. But if you only focus on step 8 and you don't even worry about the other steps that exist before that, it might just be too late for you by the time you're about to catch them, right? So that idea of deconstructing the attack vector first and then reconstructing it so you can test it systematically. So now that you have this understanding, let's see how you can potentially test this through our platform, right? So I'm going to kind of break this down step by step to look at our environment. So before I get into this, let me just quickly introduce my environment first. And let me know if my browser is visible. Okay, I'm assuming that the browser is visible. So yes, the browser is visible. Thanks for the confirmation. So, this is basically a segment, and what I've done is I've broken down my environment into 3 segments to not make it super complex, to make it quite simple for everybody here to understand it. So I have 3 segments. My first segment is my user segment, where I have 2 kinds of users: users connected through Windows systems and users who are just connected through the LAN, right? My second segment is my server segment, where I have some critical data that is stored, and typically this is like a Linux server where different kinds of data is basically stored. You can think of this as a 3-tier architecture, or it could be like multi-tiered architecture. There's farm of servers behind it, but I'm just using one system to represent that that server farm or that server system. And then I have the attacker who's on the internet. Basically, this is my internet segment. We don't know what's out there. It's the wild, wild west. The attacker definitely is out there, and the attacker is trying to come into the organization from that specific segment. Now, to protect my environment, I'm using 3 technologies. I'm using a firewall, and if you look at what this firewall is doing, it's actually protecting segments of traffic. So it's protecting traffic coming in from the internet to my user segment. It's protecting traffic coming in from the internet to my server segment. And it's also protecting traffic that is moving laterally between my user segment and my server segment. Right? So that's the level of complexity, or at least the protection that this firewall is offering. The second thing is I'm using an IDS device. So I'm using open source IDS here, which this is my Snort IDS, and Snort is also doing the same thing essentially. So it's basically inline, and it is kind of in monitoring mode. It's an IDS. It's a detection device. And it is looking at traffic that is basically moving from the internet to my desktop zone, as well as internet to my server zone, as well as traffic that is moving laterally, right? And the final piece that I'm using here is a proxy solution, and this proxy solution is pretty much doing the same. It is also inline, protecting traffic that is coming in or that is going out from internet, from user segment to the internet, as well as from server segment to the internet. So you can see that the direction of traffic that it is protecting is outgoing traffic only. There's no incoming traffic that it's protecting. So, and that is kind of shown to you by the arrow marks. So if I were to visualize this in another way, just for ease of understanding, if there is traffic that is coming in from the internet, it has to basically pass through my firewall, then it has to pass through my IDS, and then it'll just go through my proxy. Right? So this is basically the line of communication that we are looking at. For outgoing traffic, it has to go through the proxy, and it has to go through the IDS and then the firewall. So that's the direction of traffic from the desktop side. The same thing would apply if I were to kind of move laterally from my desktop segment to my internet segment. So for instance, if I'm trying to do this, again, it has to basically go through the same direction, go through each of these technologies, because they are protecting basically all three segments, right? And the same thing would apply if traffic is going out to the internet as well, because each technologies are kind of protecting that segment also. So this is the level of protection that is offered within this environment. And so to make it simple, I'll just keep it like this, just for ease of understanding. All right, so that's my environment. Now, if I were to kind of construct or at least run a few attack vectors, what I'm going to use over the course of this presentation is something called an attack library. So I'll quickly introduce this idea as well, because that is what we're going to use extensively for the rest of the presentation. So our attack library is composed of what we call as actions or behaviors or content. They're kind of synonymous with each other. The idea here is that whatever the TTP of the attacker is, whether the TTP is using a specific way of attacking or a tactic of attacking an organization, or whether it's using a piece of malware sample, or whether it is using some kind of command line instructions to execute itself in an organization's network, we basically have a way of representing it, right? So, and there are some common examples over here, like ping castle. You've got downloading of the Tor browser. You've got a lot going on here, like ghost tracker, secret traffic, etc. And this whole, when we enumerate all of these attack vectors, we have more than 2,300 right now. I think the most latest number attack vectors can potentially be related. So there's two ways to think about this. Typically, the most common way that organizations think about it is, well, that's not enough because you have 100,000 CVEs. How do these cover CVEs? But the problem is CVEs is not the right way to think about it, because if you look at each of these attack vectors, potentially one attack vector can actually be mapped to 100 CVEs. Right? So that one-to-many mapping is something that you cannot quantify. And the other way to look at this is CVEs in general is not the right approach to think about advanced attackers. Most of the times, attackers are actually running instructions in an organization's network for which there is no declared CVE. So you're not really exploiting a CVE. If I go back to my couple of examples in the past, I talked about PowerShell and I talked about PSExec. Neither one of those are exploiting any CVEs. They're just running commands that a typical administrator is going to execute in your network. Right? Where is the CVE there? There's no CVE there. So CVEs is not the right way to think about this. You have to think about this from more like an micro-attack framework perspective. You think about this more like how would an advanced attacker attack your organization, and then reconstruct that attack vector through the platform. Right? That's why I wanted to introduce this. So we'll take a look at this a little more in detail shortly. So now going back to my my deck. So let's now that we understand the environment that we'll be using as well as the attack vectors that we'll potentially be testing here, let's kind of go to them one by one, right? So the first that we look at in this enumerated list of attacks is we'll think about how do we potentially go about testing initial compromise, right? Initial compromise can happen through various ways. The example that I gave here is actually using a phishing email. The phishing email is sent across to the user system. Once it is crossed, it actually has this macro enabled in it. That macro, once executed, it actually downloads PowerShell. It actually executes a PowerShell command. PowerShell eventually ends up downloading Emotet malware, which eventually ends up downloading Trickport malware, right? So those are the steps for the initial compromise. So we will kind of replicate this. I won't run all of them because when I run an attack, it actually takes a few minutes to execute itself and for the results to publish themselves. So I'll pick one of them, and I'll just demonstrate how do you kind of test that within the environment, and then we'll move to the next stage from there. Right? So let's start with initial compromise through phishing itself, right? And the one I'll use for this, or before that, let me quickly show you another point. The way we run phishing emails, or at least test phishing emails, is by defining email profiles. So email profiles are basically your email addresses that exist within your enterprise. So for instance, you have, let's say, Shosh at say FireEye.com. So that is my email address, let's say. So if I were to test compromise against Shosh at FireEye.com, then the best way to do it is by defining Shosh at FireEye.com within our platform itself. And that mailbox get emulated by one of our actors that we have on the network, which is potentially going to receive that malicious email or send a malicious email from that specific mailbox. So we emulate the mailbox within our technology, and we send malicious emails to that specific mailbox. We don't necessarily recommend doing this for a live user. What we typically do is we ask the organization to create a mailbox for us that has the same characteristics of what you would have for a typical user. And then we define that within our technology here and then send those emails there. So by virtue of doing this, what's happening is that email gets routed through your mailing systems, and it also goes through your email security technologies as well. And that's how we test how effective your email security solution is, right? So this is a very different methodology as opposed to a lot of other methodologies that you may be used to, some of which are just simulations, and they're not really real emails that are actually sent out. Here we're really sending real malicious emails to the mailbox. So that's the difference, and we kind of define that email profile within the system over here. This has whatever your email settings are, whether it's POP3, IMAP, or SMTP, or even like Exchange. Right. All right, so let's go back to my library here, and once we have defined that email, those email profiles, we actually get to choose those email profiles. One would be profile who's sending emails from outside the unit. The other is going to be the profile of a victim who's inside your network. Right, so that's what we'll try to emulate here. I already have a list of attack vectors that I want to run, as we saw in that table that I constructed, guys. So I'm just going to quickly search for that specific email vector itself. This is the malicious email that is sent by ransomware operators, which is essentially going to download Emotet, right? So when I execute this, I have the option to choose my sender. So in this case, my sender is coming from the internet, which is a mailbox that I defined in the system, and then my victim is a user who is within the network itself, which is another box that I've defined within the system. And so when I run this attack vector, what it's actually going to do is it's basically going to send that malicious attachment, which has that macro enabled, and that macro is basically going to call PowerShell and then download Emotet. So that's potentially what is going to happen. So when I run this, this actually takes a little bit of time because it's literally sending emails across the wire. And once that is, we will see the results furnished here. I will see if I've actually run this in the past already, so I'll just show you what a typical result would look like, just to save some time for us. So, pardon me. So this was the same attack vector that I executed a few minutes ago before our presentation. As you can see here, this email actually was kind of blocked by my email security solution that I have. I've not necessarily integrated that solution into the technology here. That is why we don't have any events that says which technology actually blocked. But what's really happening in the back end is my email security solution has kind of blocked this attack vector. In real time, we can still see what is happening here. When this populates itself, I will kind of show that to you guys as well. So as you can see, currently it is kind of waiting because it is trying to send that email. Once it is sent, it basically shows up as a result later on. So that's kind of how we test an email attack vector. Typically, if it's not blocked, that is the cause of concern, and you want to start worrying about why was it necessarily blocked by my email security solution. Do I have to talk to my vendor, or are there some evidences that I can collect from internally to see why this is not necessarily blocked, right? But more often than not, you end up contacting your vendor to see why they actually missed that malicious email, and typically it would be because they don't have detection rules. So that's basically the answer there. But that's how we kind of evaluate first. So Once you've kind of moved there, just to kind of show you how this actually worked. If you think about this, what I just did was I sent a phishing email from outside the internet to that specific functional target that I had, and it was kind of blocked along its way, along the tracks, and the blocking actually happened through my email security solution. Now the next one that we look at is basically, what happens after the user is compromised. Once that specific email gets through, user gets compromised, what happens now? How do you kind of test that user getting compromised on that system itself? So for this, you have, again, a few other things that you can test. One is download of the emoted malware sample itself, because if you think about it, once the phishing email makes it to the user system, he has to still open that email. And once he opens that email, there's a PowerShell script that is executed, which actually ends up downloading Emotet, right? So that download process you can actually now test to see if your network security solutions are actually in a position to either detect or block that specific attack vector. And that can be done through the same platform, and I'll show you how to do that. But if you want to visualize this, again, the same thing is that the traffic or the Emotet malware package or payload is being downloaded across the wire, and whatever network security solutions on the way, they now have an opportunity to kind of block this, or from a command and from either a malware download, malware payload download attack vector, or a control attack vector, which happens after the payload has been downloaded. So we'll kind of look at this on the platform now. And to kind of execute this attack vector, I have to kind of go back to my attack library or my action library once again. What we'll do here is do two things. So we'll see the download of it. We'll also test command and control communication that is established by Emotet malware once it is kind of downloaded. So for this, I'll use two more attack vectors, and don't get swayed by or faced by the code that I'm entering here. This is basically this specific VID, which is like an identifier that we have. We can also search for it just clear text. So I can just say, Emotet initial, compromise or whatever that is, initial infection, and it basically does downloading. I'm showing you the exact same attack vector as well. So as you can see here, we're kind of replicating this behavior using a PCAP. And typically, if you go to the PCAP, you'll see that along that PCAP somewhere there's a payload, which basically is what we are potentially downloading. And we basically are replaying that network traffic between the attacker and the victim. Right? There are cases where we will use a sample that will be executed in a system, but we typically don't do this in a normal environment. To run that execution itself, we'll build a protected environment called Protected Theater, which is built based off of nested virtualization. That is to make sure that it is when we execute the payload, it's not infecting any other systems within your environment. And it's done in a way that protects or at least isolates that victim system where we're doing this testing. All right, so what we'll do here is we will try to download Emotet on the system. And for this, what I'll do is my source is going to be my desktop user who is unfortunately downloading this piece of malware from the internet. This will again take a few moments for it to execute. So I'll let this run in the background, and I'll move on to the next attack vector, which is command and control, just to save some time for us. As you can see, it's kind of running. If I just let it run for a couple more minutes, we will see the results kind of show up in real time. While this is running, I'll open another tab. Actually, it just executed itself very quickly. So you can see that this attack was again blocked. And it takes for a few more minutes. You can see here that it says, we're waiting for within the time frame of another 5 minutes. What we're doing really over there in the background is we're sending real-time API queries to the network security technology that exists in this network to see if the network security technology had any detection events or prevention events because of which this attack vector is blocked. Right? And we typically define a timeline within which to extract that information from that system By default, we define a timeline of 15 minutes, but here we're doing it for 5 minutes because within 5 minutes we typically get that information. So that information basically helps you understand which technology was responsible for blocking, whether it was the firewall that blocked it or whether it was the AISS solution that blocked it, etc. Right? The same thing I'm going to do now for command and control. So command and control is a step that gets executed after your emotet malware payload has downloaded on the system. So in this case, you'll see that C2 communication is happening through this one payload that is downloaded on the system. It's an exe file, and that exe file potentially sends out C2 communications to the server. So that basically is what we're going to do. I will do this again on the desktop to the internet. So assuming that my desktop user is compromised, he's going out to my internet attacker, and we just basically execute that attack vector. I'm not going to wait for this one to compile because I think you already get the idea as to how this is kind of run step by step, right? So we'll move on at this point to the next steps. So we've done initial compromise, we've done downloading of the specific payload, and then command and control communication. So what happens next after command and control communication? So you potentially end up downloading the next stages of the malware. Once you've kind of downloaded all of the different modules that you need, you essentially, and you've put together the ransomware package, you're now in a stage for lateral movement. You're ready for lateral movement. And as I mentioned in my previous slides, for lateral movement, what group ransomware operators are using is basically psexec. So they're using psexec to remotely access that specific system, as well as psexec to remotely transfer that specific file onto that system before they execute the ransomware. Right? So that's what we're going to do here. Lateral movement. If you visualize this, again, lateral movement is happening from that one specific compromised system to the targeted system that exists where you have your critical data. Now, this traffic is basically being either protected or monitored by some kind of an NDR tool or a lateral movement detection tool. And that's what we're going to examine here in this case. So for us to kind of detect this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my demo environment and I'm going to execute this. And for lateral movement, we all have an attack vector, which I'm going to use to search for within the library. As you can see, this is a transfer through psexec. We're using rook in this case. The easier way for us to replicate this is by playing packet captures, but sometimes if we don't have the packet captures, we use the actual sample itself. This packet capture, by the way, still has a sample inside of it. So if you always go back to the packet capture, you'll see that there is a file. So in this case, you'll see that the file exists over here. That's actually potentially being downloaded. But sometimes using packet capture, we actually use the file itself. Sometimes we use just packet capture. So it's just a way of testing the same attack vector by running it in different ways, right? So I'm going to very quickly go through this. So I'm moving from my desktop in this case to my server segment because that's where my target is, my final target is. And then I execute this by lateral movement attack vector. Once this is executed and whatever the results are, you know where you stand in terms of catching the attacker at the lateral movement stage. So by the way, by virtue of running each of these attack vectors one by one, what I'm doing is I'm trying to see where am I really effective in actually blocking this attack vector or this attacker if they were to compromise my network. It's not enough for me to know that I'm good to block them at the firewall stage, the initial compromise stage. I also need to know that for some reason, if my firewall or my perimeter security technologies are not able to block the attacker, do I have anything else in my arsenal that can actually catch the attacker at a different stage of the attack vector? And if I don't, then I need to figure out a way to actually be in a position to stop the attacker or at least catch the attacker. Right? So that's why you want to systematically break down the attack vectors into multiple steps and then execute them inside your environment. So that's what we're doing here in terms of lateral movement detection. I'm going to do one final step, which is the execution of the ransomware itself. I'm not necessarily going to execute the ransomware in this case, but I will do a step that is prior to the execution of the ransomware, which is the file gets dropped on that system, on a targeted system, prior to execution, right? So for this, I created a custom attack vector. So I'm just going to go after that one. Oops. Sorry about that. Yeah, so what I'm going to do here is basically the final step, which is basically the attack vector that is potentially going to be the last step before the ransomware gets executed. So if you were to think about this from the final step perspective, what's happening here is I'm again using the remote tool itself. The remote tool is PSExec, but I'm using this remote tool now to execute the ransomware, or at least land that file on that system to make sure that I'm ready to execute that file, right? And the only thing that can protect me when this is happening is my endpoint technology, endpoint security technology, either my AV or my EDR. No matter what organizations do, that is usually a bad spot to be in, because you don't want to be in a stage where you're really relying on the last step to kind of stop the ransomware file from being executed. You really want to catch them before the attacker gets to the stage, because you don't know what's going to happen if the attacker gets to the final stage, right? So that's what we'll test here. So I'm going to execute that file, or at least send that file from my desktop to the server using PSExec again, and we'll know whether or not this was blocked or not necessarily blocked, right? Because it's going to execute itself in a short while. So that's, in a nutshell, how we kind of put everything together. Now, the value of doing this through our platform is that, you're not looking at things from a simple, do I have the file or can I file, but you're also having a more deeper understanding of the methodologies that are used by the attacker. Now you're not just understanding how the attacker works, but you're also understanding how the attacker thinks. And by virtue of going through these exercises, you actually elevate yourself to that level of thinking as well. So you then are in a position to think like an attacker, and you can now, because you're able to think like an attacker, you can actually test your environment like how a real attack would be executed in this environment. Right, so that's how we want to approach this problem, and that's what our platform enables you to kind of basically do within your environments. We have another capability within the platform, which I think I'll just maybe take another 5 minutes to kind of go through before we open it up for questions. I know this has been quite long already. So that is basically the understanding of not just validation, but validation plus assurance, right? So because what we want to do most of the times is not just understand, of course, validation is the first step, but you also want to understand what is the threat model for your organization, or who are the threat actors that are typically focused on your organization, and how do you kind of protect yourself from that? And that typically happens through intelligence. Earlier today, Steve introduced the idea of Mandiant Advantage, which is basically our intelligence platform, where you are able to profile threat actors through the various levels of intelligence we have, as well as the intelligence that we collect from open source sources to kind of build that profile of the threat actor. So by virtue of building that profile of the threat actor, and you are in a position to say that, hey, I'm from, let's say, a financial sector, and I know that these are the few threat actors that typically are active in the financial sector in my country, in my region itself, and this is what they've done in the past for other organizations who are basically my contemporaries. So how do I kind of have that assurance for myself that I'm well protected against this specific threat actor? So what you do to do that is you build an assurance framework by integrating intelligence into this validation platform. And you do that by bringing in intelligence from commercial vendors, or you bring it through normal open source intelligence also. Whatever that source of intelligence is, you basically leverage the intelligence that is offered by the commercial vendors or open source vendors, and you extract the TTPs from those guys, and you build a profile. So I'll take an example of let's say A333 in this case. They're an Iranian threat actor. So what you do is you put together all of these TTPs that are coming from various sources, and you construct a profile of this threat actor. And by virtue of doing this, what you really want to do is, through our platform, you want to kind of chain the various attack vectors that the specific threat actor has. And the best way to do this is to use a framework such as MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? So what you're doing here is, within the MITRE ATT&CK framework, what are the various stages that this specific threat actor is typically active in, and what are the tactics specifically used within each of those stages? And within every tactic, what are the procedures that they are potentially executing? And for those procedures, are they using command line instructions, or are they using specific payloads, et cetera, et cetera? So that's how you kind of build that framework of a profile for a threat actor. And by virtue of doing that, you're in a position to say that, all right, so here is my MITRE ATT&CK reconstruction of the profile for, let's say, A333. And here are the areas where I think that they're specifically, active on. And if I really want to test my environment against A333, these are the stages that I'm really going to test against. And for each of those stages, what do I have in my arsenal? Or what do I have on this validation platform? Do I have samples? Do I have TTPs? Can I test those things? Okay, so that's basically what you want to do. And what we have on our platform is we have that direct one-to-one correlation between the MITRE ATT&CK framework that has a profile for a threat actor, and we kind of bring those profiles within our platform, and we kind of build those profiles within the platform. And by virtue of kind of building those those profiles within the platform, we are in a position where we can say that, hey, we understand what the nature of the threat actor is, we understand their TTPs, and we can actually give you a visualization which helps you understand what your current standing is. And that potentially looks something like this at the end, where you can say, hey, I know that this threat actor uses 5 different families of malwares. I know that this threat actor has about 30, 40 TTPs page. Let me test my environment again, and then see where I stand. So doing that, basically you're able to quantify and visualize what your risk profile is against a specific threat actor. And that is kind of, that's kind of a way to say whether or not you're effective or ineffective against a specific threat actor. So that's, in a nutshell, how we kind of do it. I'm not going to go through this on the tool itself, because I think I've already kind of overrun my time. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to have this quick discussion with you guys, this workshop with you guys. At this moment, I'll kind of open it up for Q&A to see if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So we have one question from Shamim B. So they're asking that how much effective it is in the complex Linux-based scenario versus the Windows-based scenario. So they are asking the security validation. So how much it is effective Linux-based versus Windows-based?
Okay, so on our platform, we actually have, maybe I'll just use the tool itself to kind of quickly show this. So we have attack vectors that exist, that we've known or that are known, that are capable of being executed within Linux environments as well as within Windows environments. Not all attack vectors apply between these two different operating systems. So the ones that are relevant to the Linux environments can be filtered down through this filters that we have on the platform called, where we can basically say, hey, show me the Linux ones or show me the Windows ones, right? Based on that, we are able to filter out the right attack vectors and kind of execute that.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Is there any question? We have 3 minutes more. We can take one more question. Or Steve or maybe for Josh. Okay, thank you, Shash and Steve. I think we have concluded our session within a time. Yeah. So the second question is also in line with the last question. They are asking that how does it integrate with the G Suites?
Good question. So there are multiple things within G Suite that test it. So it depends on what you really want to test. Do you want to test the email suite within G Suite, or do you want to test communication tools within G Suite? So if it's email, that's pretty simple. So Gmail actually has SMTP and IMAP controls. So all we do is we extract those SMTP and IMAP controls from Gmail, and we come to our platform here, and we define a profile. So let's say you create a dummy user who basically has the same kind of email rights as, let's say, you within your organization, right? So let's say we create better than normally Mandiant at example.com. So once you've created that email profile, we define that within our platform here, and then we basically start attacking that specific profile. When we do the definition within our platform, what really happens is when we send an email to it, that email is going to email routing system because we've defined the SMTP controls, the SMTP settings or the IMAP settings within Gmail to kind of route the email through Gmail and then land on that specific user's mailbox. So you see the email landing both on our platform as well as if you open Gmail and kind of look at the email, whether it landed on Gmail or not. So you'll see the email replicated on both sides because we're sending it through Gmail itself. So that's how we kind of do it. I hope that was not too confusing, but yeah, I'll try to cover everything.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Shash and Steve. Thanks, Steve, for throwing some lights on the effectiveness of the controls that we implement and make our security posture robust. And thanks, Shash, for going through that nice demo. I think audience definitely had a good time. They had some good learnings. So thank you so much, both of you, and thank you so much, audience, for being patient and asking questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Shash.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.